Okay, so good afternoon. Let's have a look and see. It's the 3rd of October, 2022. I'm actually going to start this recording at 13:58. And the reason and purpose I'm going to do this recording is purely because of the fact that I had a rather interesting telephone conversation with a fellow radio amateur earlier during the course of the day. And certain statements were in actual fact made, which personally I do not agree with. Secondly, I cannot find any legitimate reason why such a statement could be said, or could have been said at least. So on that note, it prompted me to, in actual fact, again, express an opinion. But more than that, I actually think, and I think many people will know where I'm going with regards to this particular video, based on the title of the video that I know I will have, I intend to upload to my YouTube channel, along with all the other controversial videos. So for those of you that do not know me, let me introduce myself firstly. The name is Chad Milam. I'm situated in Roodepoort. And my amateur call sign, of course, is Zulu Sierra 6, Oscar Papa Sierra. That's ZS6 OPS. And ultimately, at the end of the day, the OPS does not stand for Old Potstirrer. It does, in actual fact, stand for Old Papa Smurf. So that being said, introductions being done and everything else, first and foremost, directly up front, on a totally unscripted video recording. This video, please, guys, share it with all other radio amateurs. Share it with your clubs, amongst your club members. Please distribute it far and wide, and let's see if we can get a conversation going. I know that this will, in actual fact, be a controversial video. And to be quite honest with you, I don't give a continental hoot at all, because the one thing that I do want to do is actually go to the regulations, and for us to have this discussion based on the regulations and nothing else. No personal opinions, no personal sentiments or otherwise. I mean, you can call me whatever you like, except late for breakfast. My shoulders are broad enough, and if I can't take it on my shoulders due to the weight, I think I can, in actual fact, allow everything to settle on my belly itself. So at the end of the day, I challenge every radio amateur. I challenge the South African Radio League in its entirety. I challenge every club throughout South Africa to engage in this conversation, and for us to establish exactly what the legal standing is with regards to the statement. So I think, in all fairness, this is perhaps the ideal opportunity for me to stipulate exactly what was stated during my conversation earlier this day, which has prompted this video. So the statement that was categorically made verbally during the conversation earlier today was that Hamnet is the only legal entity which is allowed to provide emergency communications on the amateur radio bands. I'm actually going to pause the video at this moment in time, and I would encourage every single viewer of this video, just hit the pause button at this point and listen to what was stated. Hamnet is the only legal entity that is allowed to provide emergency communications on the amateur radio bands. And I would just like to remind everybody that I've actually received this particular statement in writing, and it's not something that I'm just sucking out of my thumb. All right, so throughout this video, we might have times where I, in actual fact, pause the video. I just want to give you a heads up on that. I need to respond to telephone calls or WhatsApp messages. So I'll just pause the video and then continue with it. So going back to what I left you with, where I asked you hit the pause button, think about it. That says that Hamnet is the only legal entity that may provide emergency communications on the amateur bands. Well, you know, the very first thing that I want to do is, before we even start looking at the regulations, I want to try and draw a couple of, just using Excel. I think this might be the easiest way of doing it, just so that everybody knows who is in actual fact speaking here. I think I'm going to move my image over. Hello, there we go. I'm not going to be using the camera directly, so we'll be working offline. But what I want to try and establish is a sort of background to a couple of scenarios. And it'll be based on, well, I think to keep this neutral and impartial, I'm not going to use any specific groups. Yes, this document is actually based on, or at least this video is actually with reference to Hamnet. But instead of using alternate businesses or legal entities, I am just going to come down to some simple terms. So Hamnet, I think that's self-explanatory, but RA will be a radio amateur. I think that will, in actual fact, just make it easier. So what I will do is I will refer to RA1 versus RA2. So we can say RA1 and RA2. And then I'm going to use two different ones. The first one I'm going to use is Charlie. This one I'm going to call this, let's just generalize a CPF, a very good example, because I know that the issue regarding the Baofeng radio in particular was directed to one group. It was a named group. Some of you out there know exactly who's been referred to, but I'm not going to mention the name on this video. However, I'm just going to call Charlie 1 and Charlie 2 with reference specifically to maybe CPFs. And then I'm just going to call these Tango. This is going to be other groups. You can give whatever name you want to give to it. You can replace that with any sort of name that you feel fit to put in its place. So let's just get these ones in such a way that they, in actual fact, make some sense. All right, so this will be T1, not C1, T1, and this, try that again, T1, and this will be T2. Okay, so we got a couple of scenarios that we need to play with here. And the first thing that I think one needs to consider is a straightforward RA1 and an RA2. Now, if you've got a radio amateur, this is now a licensed radio amateur that is speaking to a second radio amateur. Or alternatively, we might have a C1 and a C2. And we could have a T1 and a T2. Now, I want to show you a couple of things that could in actual fact be somewhat different on each of these levels. So RA and RA1 and 2, I'm just going to put them in on one category, and those are licensed radio amateurs. C1 and C2 are not licensed radio amateurs. I think let's just put them in yellow. And of course, T1 and T2 are also not licensed radio amateurs. So that there is the first level that I think I want to cover. The second level that I want to cover is what in actual fact happens if, for example, we've got radio amateurs, but we've also got CPF members who are in actual fact radio amateurs. So I'm going to put them into green, just to denote, you know, green. A green block is a licensed radio amateur. There we go. Whereas the cream color ultimately is just a straightforward commercial user. I mean, if you think about it, CPFs, they, block watches, that type of thing, they might acquire their own ICASA spectrum license, and of course, they in actual fact are working. So let's take T1 and T2 and keep them as ordinary commercial users. But then I want to bring in level 3. And of course, level 3 now, we're going to have a very similar scenario that is set up, but in this case, T1 and T2 are also, in actual fact, licensed radio amateurs. Now, the question is, or based on the statement that was made, the statement said Hamnet is the only legal entity who may provide emergency communications on the amateur bands. Well, I'm going to move this over to this side, because what I in actual fact want to do is give you a response of my opinion. Take note, my opinion. This is a lie. There you go. It's as simple as that. There's nothing else that I can say on it. That is an absolute lie. And my challenge to every radio amateur throughout South Africa, the South African Radio League in its entirety, and every single club in this country, I want you to prove me wrong in terms of my opinion that this is a lie. Show me the regulation or the law that justifies being told that Hamnet is the only legal entity who may provide emergency communications on the amateur bands. That's the challenge. If anybody in this country, and if you wanna pay lawyers and everything else, I welcome it. Come, where's the legal experts? Give it to me in writing and show me the regulation that says that that is not a lie. And I will officially apologize to every radio amateur in this country publicly via this very same platform. I am so confident in my challenge to you as an individual, a club, and as the South African Radio League, that I wish to, in actual fact, refer now directly to the regulations. And first and foremost, what we all need to understand is that Regulation 23 is the area of the regulations. Firstly, I think, let me just have a look at something at the top here. I think there is something that I should in actual fact bring in. Amateur, there we go, under the definitions. An amateur means a person who is interested in radio technique solely for a private reason and not for financial gain, and to whom the authority has granted an amateur radio station license, i.e. our chappies here that are colored in green. And shall mean a natural person and shall not include a juristic person or an association, provided that an amateur radio station license may be issued to a licensed radio amateur acting on behalf of a duly founded amateur radio association. Okay, so an amateur is the person who has in actual fact been given a license by ICASA. I think that is the simple way of looking at it. Moving forward, there shouldn't be any other question or in actual fact debate as to what a radio amateur is. Okay, moving on. Let's go down to Section 23 or Regulation 23. I know that in some circles it's referred to as a section of the regulation and others of the regulation itself. So, Regulation 23, is specific to amateur radio communications, which is then referring to those people that ICASA has given a license to for amateur radio purposes. And I want to come straight down to Section 10 or 2310, a licensee. That is a person that is in possession of an ICASA license on or is able to utilize the amateur bands. That's you, that's me, and every other ZS, ZR, ZU station that is in actual fact valid and up to date. So every single licensee is permitted to engage in communications with other licensed amateur radio stations. That's the first point that I want to make. Now, just on that point, well, let's go on. We'll take it up to this point here. So a licensee, that is any person with an ICASA license, an ICASA radio amateur or amateur radio station license, is permitted to engage in communication with other licensed amateur radio stations using the permitted amateur bands. I'm not going to discuss amateur bands. We all know what the amateur bands are. But what I want to point out is, firstly, because I know there's a lot of you out there that are saying, hang on a second, if I belong or if somebody belongs to the CPF or to another organization, they're not allowed to use their amateur frequencies to communicate. Well, actually, I'm about to show you that they can. Don't jump on your horse and say, your butt. You can your butt as much as you want. My video, please listen to what I have to say before you your butt. According to this regulation, a licensee is permitted to engage in communication with other licensed amateur radio stations using the permitted amateur bands. Okay. So the RA1 and RA2 are licensed. Guess what? They can get a very nice big tick, and maybe I should have used a different color here altogether. No, let's just put the letters OK in there. We'll center it because they can talk to each other. So on all three levels, one radio amateur may speak to another radio amateur without any problem. However, when we start looking at our C1 and C2 are not amateur radio operators or licensees, they may not use the amateur bands. However, where you have got CPF members, now take particular note, where you have got CPF members who in actual fact are holders of legitimate amateur radio station licenses, they may communicate with each other, whether you like it or whether you don't. In terms of that regulation 2310A, they can communicate with each other. Go back to the regulation. Look what it says. Now take note that C1 and C2 are both licensed amateurs. T1 and T2 in this case is a licensed amateur. The regulation specifically says that a licensee, that's those people in green, RA1, RA2, C1, C2, T1, T2. They are licensees. They may communicate using the permitted amateur bands. Right, so the first thing that needs to be considered is, and this is where I know a lot of you come in with a yeah, but. Why jump in with a yeah, but until such time this particular section of the regulation applies? You can only yeah, but when it does apply. Okay, and such communication must be restricted to comments on technical investigations, i.e. the hobby side of amateur radio. But it doesn't have a full stop there. The amateur bands, we can discuss remarks of a personal nature. So as I said to the caller earlier, you can discuss the wart on your big toe. It's not a problem. Why are the radio amateurs lying to other radio amateurs and stating it can only be of technical matters? That's a lie. That's an absolute lie, because there's a comma, remarks of a personal nature, and it still doesn't stop there. It goes on and it says, and other items of common interest. And other items of common interest. Guys, you can talk about anything you want to. Politics, religion, the wart on your big toe, building antennas, valves, you name it. You can even talk about the servicing of your motor vehicle. Now, I want to make a point quite clear here. And many of you are going to say, yeah, but that's not the spirit of amateur radio. That may not be the spirit of radio amateur going back to 1902. This is the year 2022, not 1902. Now, between 1902 and today, there's a lot of things that have come in, and a lot more rights have been granted to citizens of the countries throughout the world, and one in particular is the freedom of speech. So for those legal experts out there, correct me if I'm wrong, and I will apologize humbly and sincerely, that if this regulation were in actual fact to limit amateur radio communications to only comments of a technical investigation, firstly, every radio amateur in the country would be in contravention of Reg 2310A. But secondly, the authority, the Minister of Communications, or through the Minister of Communications, would in actual fact be in violation of all of us, of our right to freedom of expression or freedom of speech. Just stop and think about that statement for a minute before we go on. Pause the video and just reflect on that for a single minute or two, and then start the video again. I throw these little extended periods in to give you the time to actually pause and sit back and say, I wonder if the light is going to come on you, or if the light is going to stay off. And no, that's no reflection of Eskom. However, Section 23, Regulation 2310A does in actual fact give us something that we do need to take specific cognizance of. And it continues to read that says, which must not include commercial or business communication, for which other electronic or for which an electronic communication service would have been used had the amateur radio communication not been available. Simply put, quite easily put, we shouldn't be discussing business, commercial matters. In other words, hey, Joe, I've got a radio that you can buy for 1,000 Rand. That's not what we are supposed to be doing. And this is an important point of note, because many radio amateurs, and the person I had a discussion with earlier today, actually was, what is the word I'm looking for? In essence, of the opinion or belief that in the case of C1 and C2, in this case, the CPFs, would not be able to communicate on the amateur bands. And there was like a full stop there, because, you know, they'd be discussing CPF matters. Well, if they are going to discuss their patrolling matters, I would tend to agree that maybe it is of a business communication matter. And I will agree, no, CPFs or Tango 1 and Tango 2 don't bring that type of aspect into the amateur bands. That, I think, is not permitted. And that there would definitely come under that would come under the business communication, because it is the business of the CPF for example, to do patrolling, whatever the case may be. But we cannot, and this is where I want to state, we cannot just say, that's it. CPF members may not communicate with other CPF members on the amateur radio bands, because in terms of 10A, they can have technical discussions. They can have remarks of a personal nature, and they can have other items of common interest. I'm going to give you an opportunity to pause the video in a second, because if I and you, the listener, who are only radio amateurs, we are not part of a CPF or other organization. If you and I want to discuss or have a debate about whether or not CPF should, in actual fact, operate in communities or not, would that be legal? Because now, bear in mind that, in essence, we are not CPF members. And I am of the opinion that, yeah, we can have that discussion. There's nothing stopping us at all. But the question that I want to raise on this video is quite simply this. Does that mean that two CPF members? Now, remember, the first part of my question is based in this area here of its own accord. You and I, as radio amateurs only, not members of any CPF or any other entity, body or otherwise, does that mean that this category of CPF member may not engage in the exact same conversation, which for all intents and purposes may fall into remarks of a personal nature and other items of common interest? Are they in actual fact discussing business matters just because of the fact that they are both CPF members and are radio amateurs at the same time? So just stop and pause on that one for a minute, because I believe if we can engage in it, you and I as non-CPF members, they can as well. Can we run the patrolling side of CPF as CPF members? Absolutely not, because that is what should be done in the commercial side of the radio communication spectrum, not in the amateur side. Let me be clear about that. Don't run your patrolling matters or any other matters with regards to shift changes, whatever you want to call it, anything else related to CPF. But any legitimate, bona fide debate or comments, remarks of a personal nature or other items of common interest, I believe that they can. Just pause and think about that one for a minute. Now, again, you know, when we start looking at T1 and T2 on level 1, level 2, level 3, whatever the case might be, each one of the levels now, you know, I've just tried to break it down in such a way that, in essence, we are in actual fact only looking at the CPFs on the one side, but then on the other side, we are also looking at any other entities which may fall into this category. And, you know, I think at this point, it should be noted that when we start looking at this particular side here, outside of the CPFs, there is one group that I am going to specifically mention by name, because I believe that this applies to all other organizations as well, under the T1, T2s. I think you guys have had enough time to reflect on my question about having a CPF member who is a licensed amateur, having a general conversation about a CPF viability, whether one should join, whether one shouldn't join. They're all, as far as I'm concerned, remarks of either personal nature or something of common interest, which we are fully entitled to do and have in accordance with this. The patrolling side, absolutely no. The selling of your product, no, because that there is limited in terms of 10A. However, let's move on. And let's have a look at that original statement that was made, that I declare is an outright lie, that Hamnet is the only legal entity which may provide emergency communications on the emergency bands. And what I want to do is, even if I duplicate this now and put it under the heading of emergency communications, let's have a look at what in actual fact transpires here, because under this section, we are looking at technical. We are also looking at personal comments. If my spelling is right, and then common interest. And I hope that in terms of 2310A, so I'm just going to do it here, 2310A, which is what we are referring to in terms of this particular regulation. Clearly now, hopefully you guys can see that, hang on a second, guys. These types of communication are possible between radio amateurs, CPF members, other organizations, on condition. And this is on condition. It's not business or commercial related. Okay? Commercial, yeah. Let's move over to the emergency communication side. I'm going to take all of this off. And we are in actual fact now going to have a look to see, okay, what is the situation with regards to who is who in the zoo here. So those colors actually remain the same, which should all be in the cream color category. Where's it gone to? I'm going to make it a little bit darker. There we go. And then, of course, we've got the radio amateurs licensed. We'll look at CPF licensees, and we will look at other entities. And I think this one, we are in actual fact going to use a totally different color. And I think I'm going to make them blue, because I want to separate the technical personal comments, which I see as incorrectly spelt. And of course, common interest from emergency communications, because the purpose of this video is to dispel the myth that Hamnet is the only legal entity who may provide emergency communications on the amateur bands. So what I want to do is, in actual fact, go back to the regulations. And in this case, we are going to move on to 2310B. So let's make a note of it here. It's going to be the same one. However, it is 2310B. There we go. So what does 2310B says? Now, remember, firstly, we are talking about a licensee, i.e. Amateur, radio amateur, an amateur as defined in the definitions. So we need to start 2310 by saying a licensee is permitted to. Now, watch this. In the case of in the case of an emergency and where the safety of life and limb is at stake. Let's be clear where we are at the moment. We are not now going to be discussing comments of technical investigation, i.e. antennas, tubes, or otherwise. We are also not going to be discussing anything of a personal nature. So whether I've got a water on my foot or not is irrelevant, because we're not going to discuss it yet. And we are also not going to be discussing anything else in terms of common interest at all. We're just not going to do that. Because now we are going to be looking at, in the case of an emergency and where the safety of life or limb is at stake. So let's have a look. You got a radio amateur on the one side who comes across a massive motor vehicle accident on one of the national highways. A couple of cars involved, vehicles overturned. I don't know. Use your imagination. You all know what an accident looks like. I mean, I don't need to treat you like a child at all. So you got a radio amateur who comes across an incident. And I stutter. Of whatever nature. That he needs to be able to communicate with somebody else. So let's see what happens. In the case of an emergency and where the safety of life and limb is at stake, we need to be very careful as radio amateurs, guys. Don't throw your hands up in the air and say, yes, but it says, and where the safety of life or limb is at stake. I'm going to say to you as a radio amateur, I'm going to say to you as a club and the South African Radio League, unless you are a qualified paramedic, you cannot determine whether the safety of life or limb is at stake of any person. Take note of what I've said. Unless you are a paramedic or above, i.e., you have gone up into the emergency care practitioner or a medical doctor or somebody on the trauma side. You as an individual, as a club, or as the South African Radio League cannot determine where the safety of life or limb is at stake. Pause the video and think about that for a minute. Why would I say that? Okay, well, I'll tell you what. I'll give you a classical example of a case that I personally dealt with in President Street, Johannesburg, probably in 1978. As, well, it would have been a bit later, as a paramedic. However, at that time, I wasn't a paramedic. I was still a first aider, probably general first aid level. And we had a motor vehicle accident involving a motorbike accident. So it was an MVA/MBA. And the motorbike driver was walking around the scene without any problems. And in those days, yeah, you were a driver on most provincial ambulances. We didn't have the level of qualification, i.e. AMA or EMA, AMA, AEA, and all the rest of it. And so it's progressed over the years. And you normally had a driver and attendant on an ambulance. And of course, somebody had called for an ambulance, and Joburg ambulance at that time arrived, and they sat the guy down on the back and they started doing vitals, and they took off his jacket and vitals appeared to be fine. And they took off his helmet and suddenly he dropped down dead, stone cold dead. You see, what had actually transpired was that his helmet literally kept his head together. Gruesome as what it might sound. You as a radio amateur might be the one that arrives at that scene, and you see that guy walking around there and everything is hunky-dory fine. And you then come to the conclusion that, yes, is this an emergency? Well, no, because I can't do anything. There is no safety of life or limb at stake. You're not able to determine that at all, unless you are a qualified, registered paramedic with the Health Professionals Council of South Africa or some other medical board. Don't try and fool yourself. You are not allowed to do it. And that is where I would personally say, well, if it was brought to my attention that you allowed that man to die because you didn't intervene, well, ultimately, at the end of the day, you could have saved his life, and you could, in actual fact, be complicit in his death. That's it. I'm not here to beat about the bush at all. Think about it. Another time to pause. So, in the case of an emergency where the safety of life or limb is at stake, a licensee is permitted to communicate with amateur stations. Whoa. So yeah, RA1 can talk to RA2. RA1 on the second level, RA1 can also talk to RA2 on the second level. Okay, however, this goes on a little bit further and says, or any other disaster relief stations. So that means that a licensee can talk to another amateur station or disaster relief station for what purpose? To prevent loss of life. We're back down to my motorbike driver. You come across a motor vehicle accident and your motorbike driver is walking around, no problems, no hassles, whatever. Don't stop and say, I can't get on the amateur bands and actually call for assistance, because you don't know if you're going to prevent his loss of life. In other words, you don't know if you will save his life by getting on the amateur bands and calling for assistance, or if he's just going to drop down dead. You know, you might drive away from that incident, and 20 minutes later, he of his own accord takes off his helmet, bang, stone cold dead. In today's times, the qualified paramedic would have been able to, worst case scenario, still intervene and probably save the man's life once the helmet was taken off. Paramedics are taught you don't just take penetrating objects or objects out of penetrating wounds. You don't just take off a man's helmet if he's come off of a motorbike. You just don't pull a man out of a trench when the trench has collapsed upon him. There is an entire criteria that must be met. Where's our paramedics? Come, guys. Share it with your club members. Go and find your buddies and mates and ask them to prove me wrong on my statements. Paramedics are taught that there's a certain criteria and process that is followed before you pull the man out of the trench or even take his helmet off. Why? Because it is designed to prevent the loss of life. So you as a radio amateur come across an emergency situation. You are, as far as I'm concerned, have an obligation to call another radio amateur and to call for assistance. Look, to prevent loss of life, to render assistance, and to convey, to call for assistance, just in that scenario, a licensee, whoa, let's stop. I want to see if I can't possibly copy that over. To prevent loss of life, right. I just want to pick that up quickly and see if I can copy it in here and paste it. There we go. I will just say to. There we have it. Isn't that now nice and neat? Gee, it's so much fun when you start unpacking the regulations and you stop listening to the idiots that don't know anything about the regs. I had to say that because it's a given fact. So it says a licensee. A licensee. In the case of an emergency and where the safety of life or limb is at stake, to communicate with amateur stations or any other disaster relief stations to prevent loss of life and to render assistance. That's these guys. You can call any other radio amateur. But now, let's go on to our CPF boys. Man, we got a totally different ball game. A CPF member who is not a radio amateur may not use the amateur bands. So there is a very big no, and I'm going to put that there in red. They may not do it. Pause. Think. This regulation does not say that they can do it. Yeah, well, that was a bit strange. My phone has been on an outgoing call for I don't know how long, or an incoming call. So hopefully I've just educated some member of the public on emergency communications and the radio spectrum frequency regulations. So let's go back. It quite clearly says a licensee. A CPF member who is not a radio amateur. That CPF that I've referred to here is any individual. I don't care what every radio amateur says. Pick up the microphone and call for help. You're still contravening the regulations. I don't believe that it is any defense to tell any person, like your wife, your brother, your sister, if something happens, pick up the mic and call for assistance, because they are still contravening the regulations. And if they are in actual fact brought before a court, who are you as a radio amateur or club or even the South African Radio League to actually turn around and say, it's okay, we'll defend you? You know, the legal costs, you put in fellow radio amateurs into major financial burdens when it comes to their families. If you want your wife to come up and call you or call for help for you, then rather encourage them to go and do the amateur radio exam as well and make it legal and legit, because that regulation 2310B is only referring to a licensee and nobody else. Look at it. Go back. Look at it. A licensee. A licensee, i.e., somebody who has got a ICASA amateur radio station license. I actually want to take us level 2 and I want to change it a little bit. And I want to say, okay, so what happens if you got a CPF member who is a licensee, i.e., they got a radio amateur station license? Can they talk to another CPF member? Well, there you go. I don't think you need to be Sherlock Holmes to actually understand that. The answer is quite simply no, you cannot. But two CPF members, like your radio amateurs on all 3 levels, absolutely you can, because they are all licensees. Now take note that this or any other disaster relief station is there. A CPF is not a disaster relief station. And that is why I want to look at it on this side as well and say, okay, well, hang on a second. If, for example, we've got any other organization who are not radio amateurs, then the answer is quite simply no. Or where one of those people, members of the organization, are a radio amateur and the other is not, well, the answer is still no. But just bear in mind, and I think what I should do is actually insert a little bit of additional columns here, because what happens between, let's say, example, we've got an RA2 or RA1, it doesn't make a difference. Okay, so this chappie T1, can they talk to RA2? The answer in this case is also no. But, if T1 is a licensed amateur and they are talking to RA2, yes, they can. Because they are both licensed amateurs. And the same now applies here, that if your other organization member is a radio amateur, can he talk to another amateur? The answer is yes. And again, can he talk to another radio amateur? Absolutely he can, who is not a member of that organization. The fact of the matter is they are both radio amateurs, full stop. But I do want to throw one other point into this discussion, is quite simply this. Let's take all that out. If this entity here is a disaster relief station, according to this regulation, it says, a licensee may communicate. A licensee. So firstly, we need to have a licensee here. Let's put a licensee. A licensee may, in actual fact, communicate with any other disaster relief station. That's T2. I'll call this T5 in this case. They can. That one wouldn't actually apply. Okay, there's a lot of question about this disaster relief station, which I would rather deal with at a later stage and not now. The thing is, now it looks like I need to try and pause my video again, because I have got somebody at the gate. So let me just stop the share quickly and get this over and put that in. All right, so my apologies for having stopped the video during the recording process, but I did have somebody at the gate. I did say that I might have to do this because of the calls, and I would be doing it because of the calls and all the rest of it. I remember that we were at least I was last discussing, the issue of a licensee is permitted in the case of an emergency and where the safety of life and limb is at stake. To communicate with amateur stations or other disaster relief stations to prevent loss of life, to render assistance, and to call for assistance. So basically, we got up to that point where I brought in the disaster relief station and have basically said, well, look, there is a bit of gray area around this that needs some clarity. So I definitely do not want to express any opinion or remarks with regards to the specific reference made or any other disaster relief stations. Oh, excuse me. I'd like to leave it at that point and just complete the 2310B regulation that says where I ended to call for assistance. However, it doesn't just stop there. It says, or convey health and welfare messages directly connected with the emergency. Now, again, in all of these scenarios under the communication side, where two parties, whether they are registered amateurs, whether they are CPF members, communicating to other CPF members or any other organization communicating to any other organization whereby both parties are registered radio amateurs or licensees, as the regulations refer to it. The concept of conveying health and welfare messages directly related to the emergency or with the emergency are also permitted. And this is actually a very important statement that has been included here, because it does in actual fact say that in 2311, that an amateur radio station must not advertise anything, including goods or services. Now, I mean, that goes back to must not include commercial or business communication, as we saw in 2310A. But this one actually goes on and further says, or transmit any news or messages on behalf of a third person on an amateur radio station. Now, just bear in mind that 2310B actually does have an exception to the rule that health and welfare messages may in actual fact be communicated. So one again has to look at, in the general sense, you can't just convey messages on behalf of a third person. So, you know what, to be quite honest with you, if I was to pick up the microphone and speak to you directly and say, Joe Bloggs, who is also a further amateur, sends his regards. Well, guess what? I've just transmitted news or a message. Okay, well, in this case, it would be a message. I would be in contravention of this regulation. Stop and pause and think about that for a minute. Or like I've just actually done, and I openly admit it, everybody's concerned about a particular radio amateur. I just reported back that, listen, we've had contact. He is fine. All is well. Now, look at this. I've just transmitted news on behalf of a third person. Have I contravened 2311? I may have, but am I still in compliance with 2310B, where I'm conveying health and welfare messages? Okay, this is not an emergency at this stage, because in this particular case, this amateur isn't in a situation of life or death. Although we are of the opinion that it could be a problem because we haven't heard from him. So yes, it's a very gray area, ladies and gentlemen, but it is not something that we should in actual fact say, it's fine, let your wife pick up the microphone and call and do whatever, what, and it's okay. She can go to court and fight the case. It's going to cost thousands of money. I think that is very irresponsible of any person, anybody, any entity or otherwise. Don't do it, is my personal opinion. And for all of the legal experts out there, well, guys, you know what? You can give me that advice. I tell you, I definitely wouldn't take you on my case if that's the advice you're going to give me. That's my personal opinion. I'm looking for an open and honest legal advisor at the end of the day. So, and that's no dig at anybody. That's just a general opinion. And I don't see why it is necessary to put any other person in that predicament. However, I will also just want to quickly cover 2310C, which still says that a licensee is also able to practice emergency and event-related communication. Now, again, anybody in the blue block, I'm not going to now go and create a different one specifically for events, but it's the exact same principle applies throughout. If you are licensed, it doesn't make a difference whether you're just a radio amateur or a CPF plus a radio amateur or any other organization or body or entity plus a radio amateur, then of course you can practice event and emergency related communications, and you can do so at cycle, motor, marathon rallies. Now, watch this. Just watch this. The big thing is there were two major issues with the conversation. The first one, that Hamnet is the only legal entity who may provide emergency communication on the amateur bands. And reading the regulation says a licensee may. Now, watch how everybody, in particular, these diehards, are going to throw their hands up in the air again and say, well, CPF members can't do it. Or this other organization can't do it. Wait. Who said that? The regulations didn't say it. As long as that person, regardless of the organization that he belongs to, is a licensed radio amateur, i.e. a licensee, he may practice or she may practice emergency and event-related communication by providing communication for cycle, motor, marathon, rallies, and general community service. Guess what, ladies and gentlemen? Here's a further submission I make to each and every single one of you. As part of challenging each and every single one of you, I want to take it a step further. And I'm going to make the following statement. CPF members who are registered, licensed radio amateurs can come together as a CPF organization at an event and provide emergency communications or general community service. Yeah? Go and read 10C carefully. There is nothing here that says they cannot do it as long as they are licensed radio amateurs. It doesn't make a difference what organization they belong to, which is why the statement made about Hamnet is the only legal entity who may provide emergency communications on the amateur bands is an outright lie. And I challenge every single one of the listeners, every single one of the viewers to prove me wrong. Go for it. Prove me wrong on that, because I want to know where. And please, I'm going to blow this up so that you can read it for yourself without losing it, that is. I just want to bring up the whole of 10A, B, and C in particular. Read it for yourself, and I want any one of you to tell me where Hamnet is directly mentioned there. It is on that basis that, again, if any of you feel the need to communicate with me, please feel free to do so. My details are on the SOL website. I am a radio amateur, and this presentation is brought to you as a radio amateur to a fellow radio amateur. Show me where it says that Hamnet is the only legal entity that may provide emergency communications on the amateur bands. And I will apologize publicly via this very same forum to every radio amateur in this country. Please, ladies and gentlemen, read it for yourself and form your own opinion, and please stop being sheep, because it is creating havoc and causing problems. On that basis, I'm going to stop the share and I'm going to say thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I hope that you have got to the end of it. If you know anybody that in actual fact decided, oh, well, he doesn't know what he's talking about, maybe you should ask them to go back and just look at it, because what I'm talking about isn't my words. Chad never said it. Chad never wrote it. Chad never presented it on legislation, i.e. a regulation. The authority did. That is ICASA. As signed off by the Minister of Communications, there's the law. There's the regulation. What I say in a personal capacity is irrelevant to you. What any other radio amateur says to you is irrelevant to you. Whatever organization says to you is irrelevant to you. The only thing that is relevant to you is that legislation that I have just presented to you. And it is on that basis and that basis alone that I claim today that Hamnet is not the only, or is not the legal entity that is permitted to transmit or do emergency communications on the amateur bands. Every single licensed radio amateur may provide emergency communications. And for those of you that are advocating this stance, guys, please, you got to stop, man. You're doing yourself no justice. And I can only hope that this presentation really shows what a fool you actually are, because it is real foolish to present that. I can understand that every organization requires membership. Give radio amateurs their constitutional right of association and let them choose for themselves which organization they would like to join and practice or engage in emergency communications, whether that be Hamnet, whether that be SASA, XRU, Off-Road Rescue Unit, Canine Search and Rescue, Gift of the Givers, the South African Red Cross Society, Disaster Relief CERT, or any other NGO that chooses to do for themselves any activities whereby emergency communications may be undertaken. And that goes for all other parties, all other organizations. My only My only personal advice to other organizations is quite simply this. Ensure that those persons that are engaged in the exercising of their licensee rights to provide emergency communications are done between licensed radio amateurs only. Unless specific permission is given by ICASA. In terms of these regulations, I don't care if you are with the gift of the givers, if you've got two radio amateurs and you want them to talk to each other, just make sure that they are in actual fact licensed radio amateurs, because at the end of the day, the ICASA license is an amateur radio station license, which is issued to an individual, authorizing the individual to utilize the amateur bands in line with what the regulations stipulate. Emergency communications, common interest, personal comments, or comments of a personal nature, technical investigation. We've covered that. So on that note, I want to bid you all farewell after a very long video, but I trust and I hope that, again, I have stretched your imagination, number one, and number two, that I open up a conversation countrywide that could, in actual fact, bring each and every single one of the clubs, every radio amateur, and the South African Radio League to a point whereby this discussion is actually held and the truth is in actual fact conveyed to amateurs. And not this myth and, I don't know, call it BS, whatever you want to call it. I can think of many names. As I said at the beginning, I only want to concentrate on the regulations, and I don't want it to be of a personal nature. But those of you that are engaged in this conversation and this concept of a personal nature, really, I don't believe that that is in the amateur radio spirit, full stop. So I'd like to bid all of you 7-3 and 8-8 to the ladies and all the rest of the good stuff. This is ZS6 Alpottsturre signing out. Cheers all.